The clan life was the way of life in Scotland. They had established clans that took care of one another. All this changed on April 16, 1746, in the Battle of Galadin in Inverness, Scotland. There was over 2,000 Highlanders killed in that battle, 50 British troops. The Scottish people had no weaponry whatsoever other than swords and tools, and it was a massacre. It was an ethnic cleansing led by the Duke of Cumberland. And from that point on, there was a Highland Dress Codes Prescription Act passed, and from 1746 to 1782, everything that was Scottish was stripped from them. The clans were disassembled. You could not wear the kilts. You could not have bagpipe music. You could not speak in the Gaelic language.
The Scots-Irish began coming to this area. They were designated to come to this area. In fact, all of this township was to be reserved for the Scots-Irish, and they were almost all, I would say all, Presbyterian. And they selected this spot, I'm sure, because of the beautiful, strong spring that was so vital to them at that time. So here were all of these Scots-Irish Presbyterians, and they had a log church originally, about 1721. At that time, 1721, they had gone to the presbytery and asked for ministerial services. So we feel that they had a place of worship then already, and someone who remembers it said that it was in the center of what is now the cemetery, and was just a small place, but for the time being it was good until they built this building, which probably was as late as 1730.
I think there's three pastors that were really significant. The first one is the first called pastor, James Anderson. I think he served here from the mid-1720s till 1740.
And he came here from up at New York. He was at the Wall Street Church there, and took this call to the church at Donegal, and he located and then eventually in Marietta.
And not only was the first called pastor, but he was quite an entrepreneur. He bought a tract of land from a Scotsman, an Indian trader by the name of Robert Wilkins. Later that was developed into what is known as Marietta, where I currently live. It's his granddaughters who are named, get the name Marietta from, Mary and Henrietta, known as Etta. So I thought that was rather significant.
But he started the ferry at Marietta across the river, in addition to his being a pastor here. And he was a very good pastor for the Scots-Irish to have at that time, because they were having dealings with the Penns about their land, and he was a good one to help them to get everything straightened out.
Then there's, of course, Colin McFarquhar, the pastor here, when they were in 1777 led out to hold hands around the witness tree and pray for this new patriotism.
McFarquhar was a student. He was born in, in Scotland. He was educated in Scotland, even to his ministry part. And he took his vows, which meant that he should follow the king, which was, of course, from England, the King of England at the time. He married in Edinburgh, and he went to Gairloch, Scotland, and he was the minister there for some time. They had 3 daughters, but for some reason he wanted to come to the New World. And my word for that, I don't know whether he said that but the revolution only started after he got there, which was a real problem, because it meant that he couldn't bring his family over. So it was 10 years until the end of the war, and 1793, when his family was able to come and live with him. When he first came, he was on the ship that brought him to the colonies. There was a storm, and he lost everything. there was someone on the ship which understood he still had his fact that he was a legitimate minister, Presbyterian minister at that. But that was about it. And someone on the ship took him and helped him to get established, to find not a job, but to find the Presbyterian groups, the Scots-Irish groups, and become an itinerant minister here in the colonies, mostly in Pennsylvania, the area. And he traveled as far west as Pittsburgh and came back. And when there was a call for a minister here at Donegal, he applied and was given the job. Now, one of the things that really worked all the way through his time here and anywhere else that the ministers went in Presbyterian churches, they had to make sure that they were the ones that knew where the money was coming from for his salary. He did all right, and finally his wife and daughters came, and he had begun his ministry. He was said to have preached a very long prayer, or given a very long prayer, and he also alluded to the King of England. And when the so-called event, the witness tree event, happened.
Well, that's quite a story. Let me see. Every area in the frontier had a militia-type commander, and everyone over the age of 18 was eligible to be in the military. And there was an occasion. Well, let me say the local person here was a member of the Donegal Presbyterian Church, and his name was Colonel Alexander Lowry. And General Howe was a British general, and he was marching from New York to Philadelphia, and he wanted to take Philadelphia. And George Washington was at Valley Forge, and it was a very rough encampment, and he knew he had a large battle coming up, and he wanted some help, militia help. So he knew the Scot-Irish were out here. He knew they were good fighters. He knew they were sharpshooters, and he sent a messenger out here to contact Colonel Lowry that he needed help near Valley Forge.
And the person who was bringing the message knew that the men who were in the service at that time would have been at worship on a Sunday morning here at Donegal. So he came here to Donegal and evidently interrupted the service by telling them that they were needed immediately.
So the messenger arrived here on a Sunday morning in early September of 1777. And he delivered his message to the people here, the church, and the people, the men of the church decided to offer their assistance to General Washington at Valley Forge. And part of the what's called a mustering in ceremony, they came out to the witness tree, and the members of the church and the ones who were being mustered in to go fight surrounded the witness tree and pledged their allegiance to the revolution. And at that time, it was reported that Reverend McFarquhar used to always end his service with "and God bless the King" or something. He pledged his allegiance to England, and they said, "All right, men are going to go in, but if we're going to have this ceremony, you from now on must pledge to support the revolution."
He hesitated, and I can see why.
Because what people forget, his family was not here for a number of years. They were still in Scotland, and they could have been in harm's way more than once.
And he still had his oath That was the oath. He didn't take an oath here. He was already a minister. But that oath said that he would have to, obey the king. And I think that was the reason that he hesitated. I don't think that he, by this time, felt that he owed anything there, except that his family was there. And that was why he hesitated.
The pastor joined in with them too, even though he had just come from Scotland within a year or so, and was always accustomed to praying for the King and Queen of England, but he readily adapted what they wanted, and evidently loved being here and with these people, because he stayed for 30 whole years.
I don't think, for all of the troubles that they say they had with him, I think they still appreciated him and what he did, because he was the longest, and still is with the record. He's the longest serving minister, 30 years.
And the tree today, up till it lived, would have been the only live witness to that ceremony. Therefore, it became known as a witness tree. My guess would be, from figuring out the age of the tree when we cut it down, was 260 years old. If you subtract that from 1777, I think the tree would have been about 41 years old, roughly, somewhere in that area.
Unfortunately, the tree died in 1991.
Well, a lot of experts were here looking at the tree, and we put fertilizer spikes into the ground. They even drilled some fertilizer spikes into the tree, and we put trickle water into it, some said, but I think the tree was getting old.
We think maybe it was a case of the drought being really bad the year or two before.
We did everything we could. They claimed that we had to stay away from a tree as big as its canopy is. That's how far out the roots go.
Okay.
At that time, there was more people traffic and even vehicle traffic a little too close to the tree, possibly, and they say that compacted the ground and restricted its ability to grow and continue to live. But I believe it was June 3rd, 1991 is when we took the tree down.
Right now we can see where it was, because the stump of it would remain for a long time until they decided it had decayed too much, and they removed it and put some kind of a replica there for that.
Well, a society member, George Johnston, first Joan Betty, I know, engaged a local farmer here. We planked all the wood. We put it in planks, and they put the spacers between it and cured the lumber. And it went into a local farmer's barn. And then George Johnston chaired the project of turning a lot of this wood into furniture. And we made pieces of furniture. We made things like jewelry boxes, pen and pencil sets, even down to a tie tack. And we sold these things as a fundraiser to give the society more funds to do church projects and work to a bigger advantage.
And even the offering plates that are used in the church were made from the tree.
Correct. That is correct. Well, I think, as you can see, the monument to my right explains the story of the witness tree. The other monument up here explains the story that I related about Colonel Lowry being here and how we had the mustering in ceremony, and it became to be known the witness tree. These two monuments just sat here kind of on the ground, and they just looked kind of out of place. And we wanted to do some preservation. My thoughts were to commemorate this tree, that we didn't want to lose the story of the witness tree and the meaning that it had to the Revolution. And my first thought was to get a bronze replica of this depiction of the tree over here. Was originally drawn by Gray Steinmetz and used to be on the front of our book.
Mm-hmm.
And then the more I looked at that, I thought, well, I was going to do a smaller scaled one. I thought, that might not be the safest thing with all the protruding branches and bronze, and someone's liable to get hurt from that. Well, the stump was here yet for another 10 years or so after the tree had died, probably closer to 15. And I got thinking about this is the exact spot where the tree was, and to make a cast of that, a mold of that. And so I contacted a company in Lancaster who specializes in making artwork, and they do bronze. And they came out to the stump, which was about 3 feet high at the time, and made a mold of the top 4 or 5 inches, as you can see. And they mix it up and smear it, and it becomes like plastic when it cures. Mm-hmm. And then they have the mold for this. So the next I had a landscape architect assist in developing what I call a little plaza here for I call this the memorial garden for the witness tree. And so that was helping to tie in these walkways and how to approach the plaza here, and locating the witness tree replication right here in the middle, and then the boxwoods around, which are some of my favorite plants. And then we decided to add benches because this became a nice area to sit. So anyhow, when the contractor came to remove the stump, the crane and backhoe he had, it took everything it had to get it out of here. He estimated that the stump weighed about 8 tons.
Oh my word.
It was huge. So anyhow, I think the plaza has turned into a nice positioning here with the church and the new building. And it's a nice place for church members to gather. And the Donegal Society members I know gather here sometimes at reunion. And I've been out here many times when I've seen visitors just sitting on these benches, taking in the beauty of the trees and the cemetery and the church. Well, another interesting story. Mary Karnes lives in Elizabethtown, and she had a number of acorns she had taken from the original witness tree and started planting the acorns, and had 2 of them in her backyard. And one was closer to the house than the other. And she thought the oak tree as it grew up would make nice shade in the summertime. Well, as it got bigger and had more size to it, it did provide shade in the summer, but a lot of oak trees and new growth, they hold their leaves even in the winter. And well, she didn't like that part because now it shaded the house, and she didn't get the warmth from the sun she wanted from it. So I engaged a service to where they take the big blades and dig like a plug out. You know, they scoop down in, and they can get like a 3-foot by 6-foot plug. And we took it from here, where the tree is planted now, went into Mary Karnes' house, extracted her tree out of the ground. The plug that we took in there had grass on it, and we put that down, and Mary hardly knew anything had happened because it just went right into her yard. We brought that tree out here and put it in the plug that we had taken out of the ground here.
And that's the tree that's behind us.
Right, this is the tree that was taken out, and it's a very delicate thing to move an oak tree of the age that it was, but we continued to trickle water it and things like that, and watched it closely, and fortunately for us it made the transition. A major part of the Donegal Society's mission is to preserve all things outside of the church itself, the buildings, the grounds, the cemetery wall, and the spring. And primarily at this time we focus on maintenance of the trees in the grove. There we want to maintain the oldest trees for as long as possible, and replace trees as might be needed to continue to beautify the grounds as much as possible.
We are now standing by the spring, and behind us is the grove of oak trees. David, can you talk something about the importance of the spring in the founding of the church, the historical significance of the spring?
Well, yes. You have to recall that back in the early 1700s, the area didn't look like anything it does today. This was actually the frontier area in the country. And there was no roads and that type of thing. It was really just Indian trails, and then later trails that were used for trade to places east and west of here. And you took a long trip, of course, you didn't go by car, you went by horse, and you needed water periodically. So this was a place along the trail that people would stop water for themselves and for the animals. So, of course, when the church was looking for a meeting place, it was also a very attractive place to have the church because of the spring. Services then were not just an hour in the morning. People traveled by horse and buggy, I assume, but probably pretty much just by horse because the trail probably wasn't passable even with carriages in the beginning. But anyhow, the service was in the morning, and then they had a cold lunch. And the reason for the cold lunch was honoring the Sabbath. They didn't work to cook anything. And then in the afternoon they had another service. So of course the animals needed to be watered, and the spring provided that for the people at that time. I know that it was a regular feature for my young friends at that time to come down to the spring and see the many trout fishing in the water, and it was a good place just for young boys to talk and socialize and look at the fish.
And how's the spring changed over the years?
Well, the water today by government standard is not potable water. With all the agriculture going on in the area, too many nitrogens from the fertilizer do find their way, get washed from rainfall into the spring. And you know, nothing's going to seriously happen to you. I think if you take a drink, but I guess long term there could be some ill effects to that. Today it was have the fish in there as well.
Okay, so in the spring today is used for?
Well, primarily we have an annual event for children that fish here, and just for the beauty of it and for people's enjoyment otherwise.
And what's the amount of water that flows through this spring?
Well, to the best of my knowledge, it's over 2 million gallons a day.
Wow.
And there are actually 3 springs in this immediate area. We have this spring, and there's behind the Cameron Mansion there are 2 farms, and one of the farm buildings, the spring comes out from under the house, and the other one that comes out of the ground, similar to here. But of those 3 springs, the Donegal spring here is the strongest. And it's also one of 2 oldest springs in the county. The other one would be Lidditz Springs, which if you know when you go into Lidditz, you see that formalized spring wall there, similar to what we have here.
Okay, thank you. While we're standing here, could you comment on the grove of trees behind us, including the memorial ones? How are they maintained? How are they replenished?
Yes. We do maintain the grove, as I spoke about earlier, and we try to keep all the trees in good condition, but from time to time we do lose some, and we have some new young ones that I have planted right across the wall of the spring here. We've put 5 in this year as part of the maintenance of the grove, and another custom that has been part of the Donegal Society is to have a tree posthumous dedication to any past president of the society. So I do keep a stable of 6 trees that are available for that purpose.
Do you know how many trees are in that grove?
I don't altogether, but I can tell you something unique about this ground right here. Due to the age of our trees and all the agriculture around us, that the soil has been farmed for many, many years, this soil here and in the grove has never been turned because the trees are older than the time we've been here.
In the beginning, there seemed to be several houses around here where people lived, some who perhaps were caretakers, and or just lived here. Anyhow, there evidently was a small house there, and then in the early 1800s, that was enlarged to be pastor's study, or somewhere for the pastor to go in between services or some such thing. And but after 10, 20 years, they decided that they would make it into a regular residence, and that would be the residence for the caretaker. So from then on until about the middle 1900s, it was a caretaker's residence. Yeah, originally the church, I believe, was affiliated with the house across what is now across the road. The road probably wasn't there then, but it was a log cabin or a log structure, and there they held a school. And we don't know a lot about it, except that we know which part of the house now is the log structure where it evidently was held. And that evidently was the school for this area for quite a few years, because we know that as late as 1850, it was still in use as a school. And right after 1850 then is when they decided to leave the schools built on church property. So there was a building that was in our, what is now a parking area, and we have a picture of it that was used then until in the, I think the early 1700s, early like 1780 or something like that. And when the building that is down the street now and still standing was built, which looks like a more regular one-room schoolhouse.
Originally this area was settled with German, and of course we're talking here about the Scott Irish. And the German people buried their family people on the farms themselves. They buried on the farms. The Scott Irish did not. So they would naturally be looking for a place for their church and a place that would also provide for burial. There is a very small foundation, the remnants of a foundation here that's 16 feet by 10 feet. And we're not sure if that was the first church or just a meeting house, because the churches weren't heated, and sometimes the meeting houses would be smaller than the church and might possibly have a fireplace in them. So there is an area over here that has no markers, and is the area where I think the foundation was, but we don't know if that was the first church or just a meeting house.
I recall when we first moved here, that was one thing that was of great interest. There's really strange-looking tombstones that are out there. Many of them are like a table, and that is not very common at all. And so I'm not sure yet why there were so many of that type. But anyhow, it has a lot of spaces that there are no stones because they either did not put one up, or maybe it's disappeared over the years, because the earliest stone there is very early. It's 1735, something like that. And I always remember the year George Washington was born. That gives you some perspective.
If you look at all the Presbyterian churches from Laycock to Donegal to Silver Springs on the West Shore, they all have a wall similar to this. And most all these churches were founded in the 1700s. And there is a lot of maintenance with the walls as the weather deteriorates them, and they all have a cap of some sort on them to help preserve the wall. So if we preserve the cap, that helps to preserve the wall itself.
And many of these flags are marked Revolutionary War flags, so we do have Revolutionary War soldiers buried here.
Quite a few, yes, quite a few.
We're now standing in front of the Soldiers Memorial, and David, would you explain the Obelisk Memorial here?
The DAR, which is the Daughters of the American Revolution, erected this memorial in 1899. And it was a commemoration of all those who fought in the Revolutionary War from the area here, and as well as including a number of members of the Donegal Presbyterian Church. Their names are on the monument behind us. And Miss Lillian Slaymaker Evans was the first member of the DAR from the state of Pennsylvania, and she was also a member of the Donegal Church here. And ironically, you know, I spoke of Colonel Lowry coming here in early September of 1777 to recruit for George Washington some militia from here to help out and the big battle that was taken is commemorated on here as the Battle of Brandywine. And ironically, it was 9/11 of 1777.
My service began on February 15th, 1994. I've come up with 5 events I think of historical significance. The first is we went to 2 services on a Sunday. We used to have one at 9 o'clock, we went to one at 11:15, which was known as the Backdoor Church. We also went to 2 Christmas Eve services. We used to have one at 5 p.m., which is a very odd time, but when you stop to think about this church being yoked with First Presbyterian and Mount Joy, you understand that theirs was 7, allowing the minister time to go from one place to the other. When we started the Backdoor Church in the year 2000, we outgrew our old fellowship hall, and we built the current fellowship hall in 2007. Then in the late 1990s, we started a consecration Sunday. This church here had never had an estimate of giving card, nothing to sign their name to. And when we did that, the first year, giving went up 46%. And then finally, I think I'm the first one in ages to introduce a sense of Celtic spirituality into the life of the church. We've done that through adult ed classes. We'd certainly do it during the Backdoor Church and when we celebrate the Lord's Supper. And one of the things theologically that they did back in the 1700s, which was really not a good thing, is they had Wednesday night prayer services. And when they would celebrate communion, you had to attend that Wednesday night prayer service to get a communion token, or when they did serve it or celebrate it, which I don't think was that often, you couldn't take communion. Poor theology. We now have at the 9 o'clock service, servers come to you, elders and deacons, more traditional style. But at the Backdoor Church, we celebrate the Lord's Supper every Sunday through intinction, where folks come up, they break bread, dip it in the cup, and sit down. And we're one of the few Presbyterian churches that celebrate the Lord's Supper every Sunday, and even John Calvin in Switzerland couldn't do that. We have different tartans. We have the clergy tartan, which represents a calling. We have the Donegal tartan, this church, which represents a region. In Ireland, they're more regional. And then we have clan tartans that are 2 types. There is the hunting tartan, which I'm wearing today, which is a basically brown backdrop, and the dress tartan, which is a more festive-looking tartan, reds and greens and that type of thing. Well, we always have, some people, it's a sporran, it's a purse, we don't have pockets. We have a skein-dhu, a utility knife on our stocking, and we have a hat called a balmoral. It has long ribbons on it, a little pom-pom on the top, and there's always a crest badge worn on it. And McKinnon badge is a boar's head with a bone in it with, in Latin, fortune assists the daring written